Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale, the headlines. Russia receives military hardware from Iraq. Ukraine rights group accuses Russian troops of using rape as a weapon of war. And a rare dolphin show brings a sport of light relaxation for children and others fleeing Kherson. Unconfirmed reports from Western media indicating that Russia is receiving munitions and military hardware sourced from Iraq for its war efforts in Ukraine with the help of Iranian weapons smuggling networks. The sources are saying that the information comes from Iranian-backed Iraqi militia and regional intelligence services with knowledge of the process. The munitions and hardware include rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles, as well as Brazilian-designed rocket launcher systems. The sources also learned that an Iranian-made Bava 373 missile system, similar to the Russian S-300 long-range surface-to-air missile system, has been donated to Moscow by the authorities in Tehran. And the United Nations is hearing accounts of rape and sexual violence in Ukraine. A senior UN official told the Security Council as a Ukrainian human rights group has accused Russian troops of using rape as a weapon of war. Katerina Cherepaka, president of La Strada, Ukraine, says her organization's emergency hotlines had received calls accusing Russian soldiers of 9 cases of rape involving 12 women and girls. Russia has repeatedly denied attacking civilians since its invasion of Ukraine began. The UN said last week that UN human rights monitors were seeking to verify allegations of sexual violence by Russian forces, including gang rape and rapes in front of children, as well as claims by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militia that they had also committed sexual violence. Ukraine's UN mission did not immediately respond to a request for comments on the allegations against Ukraine's forces, but its ambassador, Sergei Krysleva, had told the Security Council that the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine was launching a special mechanism of documentation of cases of sexual violence by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women.
Women and girls are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and rape during the wartime. A number of facts and cases already revealed and reported, but unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg that we'll see. Many survivors remain in the situation of life threat. They are staying on the occupied territory. They are cut off from help, connection, from everything. We receive such calls to the national hotlines operated by La Strada, Ukraine. For today, we have 9 cases of rape by Russian soldiers in the temporary occupied towns and villages. About 12 women and girls, children. Reports from Kievska, Khersonska, and Chernigivska Oblast, reported by the survivors themselves and by the witnesses. Raped by a group of occupants multiple times with life threat to survivors, their children, their family members, in front of the family members and other people. Real cases, real people, real facts. We see extreme traumatization, fear for life, not readiness to talk about what had happened. Those who manage to escape somehow to safer place are too traumatized to report. They need support, therapy, recovery first. We know that many of these cases will hardly or even never be disclosed, unfortunately, as many of those suffered are killed already by Russian invaders. We know and see, and we want you to hear our voices, that violence and rape is used now as a weapon of war by Russian invaders in Ukraine.
The withdrawal of Russian troops has revealed evidence of unimaginable suffering, with killings, unspeakable torture, and sexual violence, including rape and mutilation. For instance, the prosecutor's office is now investigating the case happened in Brovary district, Kyiv region, when a Russian soldier killed a local resident and then repeatedly raped his wife in their private house. The suspect's identity has been established. The Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, in cooperation with pretrial investigation agencies and healthcare facilities, is now launching a special mechanism of documentation of cases of sexual violence by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women. Prosecutors and investigators are also closely cooperating with human rights defenders and NGOs that provide the women affected with medical and psychological support. I would like to reiterate the message delivered by my President to the Security Council a week ago. We are ready for cooperation with international institutions to ensure full and transparent investigation. It is also important that the UN bodies, including UN Women and UNICEF, address these issues and ensure full-fledged monitoring of the situation with women and children in the situation of the war of Russia against Ukraine. I would also like to draw the attention of the Security Council to the fact that the invaders have already taken more than 121,000 children out of Ukraine. Moreover, Russia is reported to have drafted a bill to simplify and accelerate the procedure for the adoption of abducted Ukrainian children, both orphans and those who have parents and other relatives.
And the executive director of UN Women, Sima Bajos, has told the Security Council that the trauma of war risks destroying a generation in Ukraine, stressing the importance of continuing all efforts to advance peace. Bajos condemned in the strongest possible way the recent attacks on Kramatorsk train station, which killed civilians and UN civil society partners. The UN official asked the Security Council and others to ensure the meaningful participation of women and girls, including from marginalized groups, in all decision-making processes, peace, diplomacy, and humanitarian assistance, and said without this, there will be no peace, development, or human security. Belarus, who had just returned from Moldova, noted that it had opened its borders and homes, hosting an estimated 95,000 Ukrainians. And also briefing the Council on the impact of war, UNICEF's Emergency Programs Director, Manuel Fontaine, said the attack on Kramatorsk station was unconscionable and just one of the many instances in the war where there had been a blatant disregard for civil life and international humanitarian law. Fontaine said inside Ukraine, children, families, and communities were under attack, and of the 3.2 million children estimated to remain in their homes, nearly half may be at risk of not having enough food. According to the UN official, in just 6 weeks, nearly two-thirds of all Ukrainian children have been displaced, and they've been forced to leave behind everything, their homes, their schools, and often their family members. The Russian ambassador, Dmitry Polyansky, had denied Russian involvement in the attack on the Kramatorsk station, as well as other incidents. According to him, the already organized and planned provocations, along with the widespread use of civilians as human shields, are shocking by their inhumane attitude to the fate of the people in Ukraine and are testimony of the complete disregard by the Ukrainian Nazis of the norms of morality and international humanitarian law.
Brutality displayed against Ukrainian civilians has raised all red flags.
Ambassador.
The governor of Kharkiv, Oleg Senyubov, says 11 civilians have been killed by Russian shelling in that region of eastern Ukraine overnight. And according to him, one of the victims was a 7-year-old child. More than 14 other people were said to be hospitalized. Mr. Senyubov also warned residents not to touch or approach any ammunition, but to alert rescuers if they see any. He said the Kharkiv region was shelled 66 times with rocket launchers, artillery, and tanks. And in his weekly, or rather daily, Ukrainian message, President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russian forces could use chemical weapons in Ukraine, but he did not say that chemical weapons had already been used. Mr. Zelensky had said one of the spokespeople of the invaders mentioned they were considering using chemical weapons against the defenders of Mariupol. There were unconfirmed reports suggesting that chemical weapons had been used in the southern port city, which had been under siege for nearly 7 weeks. Ukrainian leaders have said tens of thousands of people have likely been killed in Russia's assault on Mariupol. If confirmed, it would be by far the largest number of dead so far reported in one place in Ukraine, where cities, towns, and villages have come under bombardment, and bodies, including those of civilians, have been scattered on the streets. To the north, rescuers continue to search for the missing in the recently liberated town of Bodoryanka near Kyiv, digging through rubble of building as family and neighbors looked on. Local rescue authorities say they did not know how many civilians were under the debris, but had gotten phone calls from people claiming to be trapped. Ukraine says Russian forces are massing for new offensive of eastern areas, including Mariupol, where they've been without water, food, and energy supplies for weeks. Hundreds of small explosive devices were found scattered over a residential area of the eastern part of Kharkiv. According to residents, they said they heard whooshing sounds in the early morning of yesterday and later found hundreds of small explosive devices in green plastic casings scattered in the yard and on nearby roads. Demining engineers were deployed in the area to search for and detonate the explosives remotely. Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Overchuk, head of the demining unit of Kharkiv's State Emergency Services, identified the devices as PTM-1 landmines, small timer-operated devices carrying up to 1.5 kilograms of liquid explosives. In his nightly address to the nation, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the troops retreating from parts of northern Ukraine had deliberately left thousands of mines in their wake in what he considered a war crime. According to him, in those areas, tens if not hundreds of thousands of unexploded ordnance had been left behind, and the teams were working to clear these dangerous items. And still staying with President Zelensky, he's asked Seoul, that's South Korea, to provide military aid, as he said Russia could only be forced to make a peace. Speaking in a video address to South Korean lawmakers, Mr. Zelensky said his country needed more help, including weapons if it is to survive. Mr. Zelensky said South Korea had many weapons that could not only help save the lives of ordinary Ukrainians, but help prevent Russia from attacking other nations. There is none and there can be no hope of peace if Russia will not simply stop on its own. And Russia can only be forced to do so and can only be forced to seek peace. Seoul's defense ministry had said that it had rejected a request by Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleg Reznikov for anti-aircraft weapons. In a phone call, the defense minister said such weapons of lethal nature will be limited in light of South Korea's security situation and its potential impact on military readiness. Mr. Zelensky did not mention that rejection, but said the usual rules for supplying weapons must be reviewed and acted upon quickly. And Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby says that Russia's newly appointed general overseeing Ukraine, Alexander Dornikov, has a history of disregarding civilian harm, and he expects that his appointment is turning another page in the same book of Russian brutality. The comments come 2 days after Russia appointed General Dornikov to lead its forces in Ukraine. Russia's invasion had forced around a quarter of the population to leave their homes and turned cities into rubble and killed or injured thousands.
He and other senior Russian leaders have shown in the past, and you mentioned Syria as one example, have shown clearly in the past their disregard for avoiding civilian harm. Their utter disregard in many ways for the laws of war, laws of armed conflict, and the brutality with which they conduct and prosecute their operations. There's a track record here before Ukraine of Russian brutality. And you've seen it on display every single day of the last 46 days. Sadly, we can all expect that those same brutal tactics, that same disregard for civilian life and civilian infrastructure will probably continue as they now focus in a more geographically confined area in the Donbass. You heard the chairman talk about this at testimony last week, that it was his assessment, and we believe he's right, that this could augur in for a more protracted and a very bloody next phase here of this conflict. And I don't know, I wouldn't pretend to say that we know for certain that this new general is going to be the author of some new additional and more bloody tactics, but we can certainly say by what we've seen in the past that we're probably turning another page in the same book of Russian brutality.
Australian Chancellor Karl Nehammer said that his meeting with President Vladimir Putin in Moscow did not leave him optimistic after he arrived seeking either an end to the conflict in Ukraine or humanitarian solutions for civilians there. According to him, I generally have no optimistic impression that I can report to you from this conversation with President Putin. The offensive in eastern Ukraine is evidently being prepared on a massive scale, according to Mr. Nehammer, who told a news conference at the Austrian embassy this after his afternoon meeting with the Russian leader. Neutral Austria, which obtains 80% of its natural gas from Russia, generally maintains closer ties to Moscow than much of the European Union, but that has not been the case recently. Mr. Nehammer has expressed solidarity with Ukraine and denounced apparent Russian war crimes, while his government has joined other EU countries in expelling Russian diplomats, albeit only a fraction of the large Russian diplomatic presence there. While German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said he welcomed Mr. Nehammer's meeting with President Putin, the reactions at home have included surprise, skepticism, and even outright condemnation. European Union foreign ministers plan to intensify the delivery of weapons to Ukraine, according to German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who was speaking after a meeting that led to new sanctions against Russian interests. Quote, the freedom, the independence, but also the security of Ukrainians can only be defended with weapons. That's why we together as the European Union, as friends of the Ukrainian people, will intensify the delivery of these weapons, unquote. Also speaking after the meeting, European Union Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell says ministers couldn't agree on energy sanctions because of different levels of dependency on Russian gas with the 27-member bloc. He also said the European Union would halt part of its training of Mali's armed forces, citing lack of guarantees from there that Russian military contractors would not interfere in their work. Mali's transition government, which took power in 2020 in a coup, is battling Islamist militants and has enlisted the help of private military contractors belonging to Russia's Wagner group.
Energy issues are much more important in Central Europe than in the west part of Europe. This is a pure asymmetric shock, and it has to be managed combining unity and solidarity. It's easy for some member states that are not using Russian gas to say that they are ready to not use Russian gas. But for others, which are heavily dependent, it's not so easy. Everybody has taken conscience of the big risk of this strong dependency. On sanctions, we continue discussing about how to implement these sanctions to avoid any kind of loopholes. We measure the impact that these sanctions are having on the Russian economy, and we will continue discussing in order to see what else can be done. Nothing is off the table, including sanctions on oil and gas, but today no decision was taken.
We'll take a break on Russian invasion. We'll be back with more stories, including taking a snap look at what has been happening on the ground in Ukraine over the last 24 hours, as well as Belarus suffering from the sanctions as Western companies in there flee. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February, economic sanctions on Russia have had spillover effect on its closest ally, Belarus. So far, over 100 companies have left Belarus. Nearly 6,000 apps were removed from app stores in Belarus between February 24 and March 14 this year alone. Companies' divestments in Belarus are increasingly rapid, striking a blow to the regime's attempts at becoming an entrepreneurial hub. The exodus of its IT specialists has been increasing, hitting the one sector which had been diversifying the Belarusian economy, and the only sector which was actually helping it to improve its resilience to macroeconomic shocks. So let's talk a bit more about this. Today it isn't really Russia, Ini. Ini, welcome. Thanks for joining us as always.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're talking Belarus, which is suffering, shall we say, collateral damage.
Yes, it is. And it seems even before now, the economy wasn't so strong because some have called it, it's under authoritarian regime. The president there has been there for about 30 years and doesn't look like he's going to leave very soon. But like 3 weeks ago, there were truckers who blocked the trade routes between Belarus, from Poland to Belarus, heading into Ukraine. And of course, all this disrupt trade in Belarus. So it's a fragile economy that is feeling a whole lot of blows at this time. And as you read there, over 100 companies have left. One of them is Wargaming. They had their headquarters in Belarus. It's worth about $1.5 billion. So it was a major, and like you said, the IT specialist, IT was like the diversification that we are asking for back here in Nigeria. That's what they were depending on. That's what the economy was looking at outside oil and you know, some other major exports that they have. So the IT sector was one area that was holding the economy. But now you have the brain drain, as we discussed in Russia yesterday.
Yes.
They have that. And then with all these apps leaving the country, I mean, what are specialists doing? There's no job for them. So obviously they leave. And the economy is actually really, really feeling, I mean, they're not like Russia that have so much strength they can withstand the sanctions and the impact of the sanctions. For them, Belarus is really feeling it. And we hope, or they hope, Russia can come to their aid.
That was what I was waiting for. But Russia has its own battles at the moment.
Of course, they have their own battles.
May not consider helping them to be at the top of their list right now. Now, the other thing that appears to be a big problem, if you like, business-wise, is the issue of sugar. But not the way we had been discussing it before now.
Yes, exactly.
Can you tell me what's the difference?
Yeah, so before now, we've been talking about sugar and wheat and bread and all those staple foods, which sugar is an ingredient for. Now, we go to the source. So sugarcane, of course, everybody knows, is a major source for producing sugar. And sugarcane now has many more uses, you know, with the ban on sanctions, not ban on Russia oil, but at least the sanctions.
That's right.
And country trying, because of the sanctions, they do not want to maybe sponsor or pay for the war, so they don't want to buy Russian oil. So everybody's looking for an alternative. One of that alternative is ethanol. It's used for alternative energy, and that comes from sugarcane. So sugar is no longer the priority for making for sugarcane. Right. So that places more demand on sugarcane. As we speak, the price of sugar has gone up about how many percent? Because Russia is the 8th largest producer
in the world
of sugar. So, you know, so we don't have sugarcane coming from Russia. The ones we have in the global space is now being used for ethanol to try to produce energy for the Western countries because of the cold and everything. So sugar goes to the back space, but ethanol coming up here also. And, you know, another thing that they use for ethanol is corn.
Right.
Before the war, the price of corn had already gone up. And then that's in Nigeria. Now, with the war, having Russia and Ukraine as major contributors to global supply of corn, so there's even less raw material for ethanol. So that means that's another pressure on sugarcane. So sugar takes the back seat. And once again, staple foods take the back seat and prices go up.
And it's not just energy and the countries that are trying to explore energy as an alternative, as you and I were discussing. industries that are reliant on sugar, breweries,
Yes.
soft drink
Yes.
manufacturers, those who produce pastries, anything basically biscuits.
Anything that has
any kind of sugar
yes,
in
and
it.
you know, some of those industries also use ethanol too. So it still goes back to sugar cane. And you can't just plant sugar cane and expect
it to...
So you cannot increase the supply just like that.
Just like as we found, or as we are finding out, you cannot increase the supply of wheat overnight.
You cannot.
And that's
and you cannot change your environment or your weather so that if you were not, like in Nigeria, you know, there's a certain quality of wheat that we need that we cannot, because of our weather and our soil and all that, we have to import it. So we cannot actually change all of those things. So even if we do produce wheat, it's still to an extent. There are still some parts that will have to import into the country.
Now, before we came on, you and I were discussing continued threat of sanctions. President Biden spoke with Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India.
Yes.
And hovering over the discussion was this threat of sanctions, because in spite of everything that has happened, India continues to buy Russian oil, and not just little...
And they have said that, oh, they're just doing about 1% or 2%, but the thing is, then you keep boosting Russia. But India is actually in a tight corner. So India does sales with Russia, about 8.1 billion, you know, talking about imports.
Right.
Meanwhile, with the United States, they do 113. So now they're in a tight corner. And they have even said, okay, so who do they please? Who do they... that's why you see they've kept a neutral stance for a while. But they have also said, okay, so they're supporting Ukraine with, you know, materials and all that, but they're actually in a tight corner. You know, their population is really hard. So even though they are still buying cheap crude from Russia, that's just 1% or 2% that they are buying. So they still have a huge need to satisfy their people. Now, guess what? They have, I think their major refinery in India is called Yahara, you know, something like that. It's in India, but 49% of it is owned by a Russian company, which has been affected by the sanctions. So the refinery can hardly work now. So India is actually in a dilemma of some sort.
Corner.
Very tight corner. So the refinery is not working. It's in their country. It belongs to a private individual or private corporation. But it has a major sponsor from Russia, which has now been affected. And so they are there, fine, they're not directly affected by the sanctions, but they cannot refine at this time. So India just has to find a way around. And don't forget that, you know, they have their swap currency working.
Of course.
But they have said, we don't know how they're going to do that, they have said that they will not firm that arrangement until there's been peace, until there's peace in Ukraine. But we don't know how
that will work.
Exactly.
National interests always trumping. Before I let you go, I also want to talk about something I read. The EU is not able to agree yet again on the issue of sanctions.
Yes,
because
sanctions of oil.
On oil. I mean, some of the countries say, yeah, it's easy to talk about sanctions because you are not so dependent.
Yes.
But for some of us who are quite dependent, we may not be able to quickly join you on the other side. There. And that is having its impact on prices. I remember that last week, was it? Ladi and I were discussing the issue of oil prices and the topsy-turvy nature.
Yes, it's really going topsy-turvy. Early this morning, price was about 99. Just before I came in here, it was over 100. So it's really, although for oil now, one of the major factors affecting it is the COVID outbreak that's coming back in Shanghai and some other Asian countries. That's also...
The fears that the world might again be headed in the direction of... And many of the areas are places with huge populations. China, Hong Kong,
so
and
some of them have
States.
lockdowns now. Shanghai is locked.
It's already locked down.
Exactly. So demand has dwindled, you know, and then we also have that reserve coming from the U.S. But like we said, it doesn't really change, or it hasn't really, like India says, I mean, what they are getting from Russia is just 1% or 2%. So they still need a whole lot. Yeah, so that is why the price is still going up and down. So when we hear, oh, there's been lockdown in Shanghai, then demand goes down, or people anticipate that demand will go down, then the price goes down. And then, oh, things are coming back normal, there's extra demand here, and then the price goes up again.
We'll have to keep an eye on all of this, because there's so much of this, and it keeps unraveling every day, and new effects.
More sanctions, more impact, widespread effects, you know, price of food and commodities.
I don't envy investors or those of you who report business, because just as you're putting together the analysis for one thing and then something else comes and torpedoes the whole of that. Idi John Mekwa, thank you so much for unpacking this morning. Of course, there'll be others. Details right after this show on Business Morning and Business Incorporated. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
A French team has arrived in Ukraine to help local investigators to look into allegations of war crimes around the capital, Kiev. France's ambassador to the country, Etienne de Ponsens, made the announcement, adding that this is the first foreign unit to offer such support. Claims of civilian killings at Bucha caused global outrage last week, as Ukraine claimed some 1,222 bodies were found in areas near Kiev recently left by Russian soldiers. Meanwhile, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Moscow will not pause its military operations before the next round of peace talks with Ukraine, even though he also says there's no reason the talks should not go ahead. We're learning that 17 children died in the attack on the train station at Krematorsk, but officials say 4 adults and 2 children had been discharged from the hospital. And days after Russia's suspension from the UN Human Rights Council, North Korea, which is among the 24 countries that voted against the move, has now denounced the decision. The government instead blames the United States for instigating the vote, saying in a statement that what the U.S. is after is to isolate independent countries and force changes and challenging them at the international arena so as to maintain its illegal and inhumane hegemonic order. The statement goes further to say international organizations should not be abused as a means for the United States to put political pressure on countries.
The French ambassador's announcement comes as President Volodymyr Zelensky says tens of thousands of people are likely to have been killed in Russia's assault on the southeastern city of Mariupol. He was addressing lawmakers in South Korea via video conferencing. While the widespread destruction of Mariupol cannot be independently verified, President Zelensky has requested more military aid to help fight the Russian forces. He did not specify which weapons he sought, nor said South Korea had many weapons that could not only help save the lives of ordinary Ukrainians, but help prevent Russia from attacking other nations. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says Germany sees massive indications of war crimes in Ukraine and that the government has already made it clear that there will be a complete phase-out of fossil fuels, starting with coal, then oil and gas, so that this can be implemented jointly in the European Union. EU foreign ministers are meeting in Luxembourg today to discuss new sanction proposals for the EU oil embargo on Russia. The European Parliament last week voted for an embargo, although its decision is not binding. Galvanized by what Ukraine says are senseless killings of civilians by Russian troops since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the bloc last week approved a 5th round of sanctions on Russia that included an end to Russian coal imports.
We now have coal as part of a sanctions package. We know that the Commission is also now working on a future package that we hope we can see soon that will involve oil as well.
Meanwhile, Russia says that it had used cruise missiles to destroy S-300 anti-craft missile systems, which had been supplied to Ukraine by an independent European country. Russia launched Caliber cruise missiles on Sunday against 4 S-300 launchers, which were concealed in a hangar on the outskirts of the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. Russia said 25 Ukrainian troops were hit in the attack. Russia did not say which European country had supplied the S-300 systems. And as the conflict continues in Mariupol, civilians and refugees in the city are in dire need of humanitarian aid, especially for those living in the center of Mariupol. At a hospital on the outskirts of Mariupol, more than 10 people are admitted an average day due to escalation of the conflict, most with shrapnel injuries. The conflict has upended most people's lives completely in the city. Nearly 8,000 people have gathered in an humanitarian aid center for daily necessities. And in the city of Kramatorsk, a video shared by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine shows bodies on the ground, people's belongings and blood stains on the ground after a missile strike hit a railway station in Kramatorsk in East Ukraine on Friday. More than 30 people were killed and over 100 wounded at the station, packed with women, children, and elderly evacuees. Head of Ukrainian Railways says at least 2 children were among the dead. Kramatorsk Major says about 4,000 people had been at the station at the time of the attack.
The death toll in that train attack has now risen to 57. And Lithuanian Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė has visited Borodyanka, a town near Kyiv recently retaken from Russian troops. Šimonytė, accompanied by her Ukrainian counterpart Denis Shmyhal, visited the town. Rescuers recovered the bodies of 7 people buried in the rubble of 2 destroyed high-rise housing blocks. More than 200 rescue workers have been scrambling to find missing residents since Ukraine retook the city west of Kyiv after Russian troops began pulling back from the region. The recovered bodies pushed the death toll there to 19 people found in the rubble, and that's according to state emergency services. President Volodymyr Zelensky had said that the situation in the town is significantly more dreadful than in nearby Bucha, where Ukraine has accused Russia of war crime. Moscow denies that allegation. During her trip, Ms. Šimonytė held talks with Shmyhal in Kyiv on humanitarian and military aid Lithuania may provide, and attended the ceremony of signing an agreement on the protection of Ukrainian children that became victims of war.
My God, it was 2 months ago when we were sitting in the same place, wearing suits, and still hoping for a better development that they actually happened. And when we were sending over those Stingers that week, I was saying I wish Ukraine will never have to use them, so most probably all of them are used long ago.
We'll take another break, and when we return, 1 hour of joy for refugees in a dolphin show. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. All options would be on the table in response to any use of chemical weapons in Ukraine by Russia. And that's according to the British Armed Forces Minister James Heappey, who says Britain was working with its partners to verify the details of reports that Russian forces may have used chemical agents in an attack on Mariupol, where thousands are believed to have died under a near 7-week siege. In an interview, Heappey said British Defense Intelligence so far had been unable to verify the reports, but that they were working urgently to understand whether or not chemical weapons have been used. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia could resort to chemical weapons and called on the West to impose strong sanctions in Moscow that would deter even talk of the use of such weapons.
So I'm afraid that we know nothing more than you've been able to report, which is that there were some reports circulating on Ukrainian social media yesterday evening that chemical weapons had been used in Mariupol. Overnight, that's not something that Defence Intelligence here in London have been able to confirm, nor any of their intelligence counterparts with our allies around the world. And indeed, President Zelensky's address last night also referred to reports, so there's been no verification within the Ukrainian system either. However, to be clear, we are working urgently to understand whether or not chemical weapons have been used. And if they have, as the Foreign Secretary has said, the people responsible will be held to account. The use of chemical weapons is abhorrent. It does cross a line, and all options are on the table for how we would respond. Well, invariably, we rely heavily on the Ukrainians to be able to give us some sense of what has happened, because Mariupol is a heavily besieged city, and it's not somewhere that anybody can go. There are other intelligence assets that may be able to assist in that, but those are capabilities that you wouldn't want to talk about on air. But verifying it is clearly very important, because if chemical weapons have been used, that is a very important moment for our Prime Minister and other heads of government around the world to consider how we would respond. But as I've said, all options are on the table, and President Putin should be clear that the use of chemical weapons is simply not acceptable, and he shouldn't expect the West to stand by if they were used. So I'm afraid that we know nothing more than you've been able to report, which is that there were some...
And that's the British Armed Forces Minister, James Happy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says thousands of Russian troops are massing for a new offensive in the eastern part of Ukraine, and Russia has said it would not halt its military operation in Ukraine for any further peace talks. Donetsk Regional Governor Pavlo Krylenko had said 109 people were wounded in the attack. That's an earlier attack on the Kramatorsk station on April the 8th, and that the station was full of people trying to leave, resulting in 57 deaths. However, Russia has denied any responsibility for that attack, saying the missile was Ukrainian. Meanwhile, refugees from Ukraine have arrived in Isakia in Romania by ferry. Amongst the refugees were mostly women, children, and the elderly. Aid workers welcomed them and helped them with their luggage as they disembarked. But according to the Romanian border police, over 10,000 Ukrainians have entered Romania, that is, as at last weekend, an increase of 16% compared to previously. Numbers by the United Nations put the amount of Ukrainian refugees at over 4.5 million, of which 2.5 of them have fled to Poland, while over 686,000 were in Romania. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Washington is asking allies not to increase Russian oil purchases, hours after officials said President Joe Biden had told Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi that buying more oil from Russia was not in India's interest and could hamper the U.S. response to the war in Ukraine. Mr. Biden stopped short of making a concrete ask of Mr. Modi, noting India has concerns about deepening ties between Russia and China. But he told Mr. Modi India's position in the world would not be enhanced by relying on Russian energy sources. The sentiment was echoed by Mr. Blinken at a joint news conference with India's External Affairs Minister Subrahmanyam Jaishankar. Mr. Jaishankar pushed back against a question on India's energy purchases from Russia, saying the focus should be on Europe, not India. He added probably out of our total purchases for the month would be less than what Europe does in an afternoon. Broad talks between the world's two largest democracies took place as the United States seeks more help from India in condemning and applying economic pressure on Russia for an invasion Moscow calls a special military operation. Mr. Modi also said he had suggested in recent conversations with Russia that President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hold direct talks. The South Asian nation has tried to balance its ties with Russia and the West, but unlike other members of the Quad, the United States, Japan, and Australia, it has not imposed sanctions on Russia. Mr. Biden had recently said that only India among the Quad group of companies was somewhat shaky in acting against Russia. Lured by steep discounts following Western sanctions on Russian entities, India has bought at least 13 million barrels of Russian crude oil since the invasion began in late February, much more than approximately 16 million barrels for the whole of last year. Talks in Washington had taken place between the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and their Indian counterparts Jaishankar, as well as Rajnath Singh.
We also share a commitment to our democratic values, such as protecting human rights. We regularly engage with our Indian partners on these shared values, and to that end, we're monitoring some recent concerning developments in India, including a rise in human rights abuses by some government, police, and prison officials. I would note, India has made very strong statements in New York at the UN, the minister before the Indian Parliament, condemning the killing of civilians in Ukraine, calling for an independent investigation of these atrocities. And I would also note that India is providing significant humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine, notably medicines, which are very necessary and in real demand. India has to make its own decisions about how it approaches this challenge. We, as a general proposition, are consulting with all of our allies and partners on the consequences of Putin's war, the atrocities being committed against the people of Ukraine. In our judgment, it is important that all countries, especially those with leverage, press Putin to end the war.
Now, as Secretary Blinken has pointed out, we have made a number of statements which outline our position in the UN, in our parliament, and in other forums. And briefly, what those positions state is that we are against the conflict. We are for dialogue and diplomacy. We are for urgent cessation of violence. And we are prepared to contribute in whatever way to these objectives.
And just before we go, a dolphin show has provided much-needed respite from the horrors of war for several dozen Ukrainians, many of them children fleeing the heavily bombarded city of Kherson. For an hour or so, the refugees were able to set aside their cares and enjoy the spectacle of the dolphins leaping, playing with balls, and swimming with their trainers at the Nemo Hotel in the Black Sea port city of Odessa.
Odessa is always very polite and positive city, and we prepare for them also small show with dolphins, which is getting in the dolphinarium, and around 50 people coming to watch the show. How the dolphins are, they are very positive. They don't care about war. They don't care about nothing. Yeah, and they show the emotion.
A rare glimpse of hope and some level of joy for the young ones. That's how we're going to end the Russian invasion this morning. Thanks for being with us. There's an update, as always, at 5 o'clock within the world today. I'm Ladi Akuridu. Do go out there and have yourselves a pleasant Tuesday.